All right. So Dave Thomas is a tour guide as well as an excellent drummer, and he has kind of worked on this talk for the last couple years to try to really kind of refine it. And so I thought this is another great example of trying to get this information out there. We do every single year a presentation on the 1970 Jazz Fest, which is the original Jazz Fest where we have video, but there's a lot to be said about what happened before that. So with that, I'm going to let Dave go ahead and talk to us about the 1960s Jazz Festivals. Thanks, Dave. How are you?
Good. How's the audio? Can you hear me?
Everything is good.
Awesome. Awesome. So I presume y'all are looking at a screen that says Jazz Festivals of the 1960s.
Yep, we do.
Awesome. I want to thank Jason for inviting me to do this, and also the previous presenters for good talks and laying the foundation. And hopefully I can continue the strong tradition this morning. I do want to acknowledge this is an adaptation, as Jason alluded to, an adaptation of a presentation that Al Jackson and I have done, I don't know, 2 or 3 times. The Jazz Museum, maybe most of them have been. It's not exactly the same because I've adapted it specifically for this, but there's some stuff that's going to be familiar to people if you have seen that presentation. And as part of this, I want to acknowledge Al. He's not doing this presentation with me, but he was a big impetus for the original one. I had been vaguely aware of jazz festivals in New Orleans before the Big Kahuna that started off in 1970, but I really didn't know a lot about him. And I ran across Al in the coffee shop in Treme, and he had a bunch of posters out and a bunch of information. And he knew all about all these festivals that had occurred at least as far back, I think, as 1949 and maybe earlier. And so I just got fired up. I said, this story has to be told. And he had a weak moment, and I was able to recruit him to help me tell it. And Al, of course, is the curator of Treme's Petit Jazz Museum. So you should swing by that when you can and have a chance to see it. So that's where this thing came from. Roadmap for today. We're basically going to go through 4 parts. I'm going to do a brief overview of the current Jazz Fest for reference, 1970 to the present, basically the Jazz Fest that we know and love. And then I'm going to talk about the fits and starts through the 1960s, essentially multiple failed attempts to achieve what became our current Jazz Fest. It wasn't a total failure. There actually were some jazz festivals in the 1960s. Maybe from the middle, certainly into the later 1960s. And I think of those as our immediate predecessors to our current Jazz Fest. And then there is a bonus round. We're going to give you a chance to show off some of your festival knowledge from the 1960s. And it's not quite this linear. There's a little bit of overlap in some of this stuff as I go through it. So Jazz Fest, the one we know today and love. Brief overview. Basically, it's run by Quint Davis through his festival productions in partnership with AEG. And a guy by the name of George Wein is sort of an emeritus guy now. I don't think he's really active in anything. It's out at the Gentilly Fairgrounds racetrack, either 7 or 8 days over 2 weekends. They say it's going to be 8 days going forward. 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. A mixture of national, international, and local performers. And there is, in spite of all the high profile national acts, there's a heavy emphasis on local performers. I think Quint cites about 80% local performers. 12 to 14 simultaneous performance spaces. And that includes, I'm going to highlight this because I'm going to reference these from the other things, 1 traditional jazz tent, 1 modern jazz tent, and a gospel tent. There are no affiliated night concerts, although there are a lot of night concerts in the city. They're mostly at the clubs and other venues, and the Jazz Fest does not really sponsor them. There is Mardi Gras Indian participation in the neighborhood of 400,000 single day admissions, and the admission price is around $75. It depends on how you buy it, when you buy it, and we're always waiting to see what the next price bump is going to be when they announce it. And it's known as the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival. So as Charles alluded, this goes back to the 1970, when it started out as the New Orleans Jazz Festival and Louisiana Heritage Fair. So it's helpful to understand that they actually had what they envisioned as two separate components. The New Orleans Jazz Festival was thought of as nighttime concerts, and the Louisiana Heritage Fair was thought of as the daytime activity. George Wein was the original producer. He was the big deal for this, and he recruited help from two locals, Quint Davis and Allison Minor. And as we mentioned from the previous slide, Quint is still involved very actively. Allison Minor, no longer, she's now deceased. Was held primarily in Congo Square, at that time officially known as Beauregard Square, although I don't think anybody really referred to it as that. There was no Armstrong Park. And the Tremaine neighborhood there was in transition from an actual neighborhood into Armstrong Park. I think by the time the festival occurred, probably much of it had been demolished, although the park didn't really come along until the late 1970s. It was one weekend, it was noon to 6 p.m., and there were a mixture of national and local performers, and there were 3 daytime stages: a blues stage, a Cajun stage, and a gospel stage. There was no tent, but there was a stage specifically dedicated to gospel. And I highlight these 3 things, among others, because we can still see the legacy of that today. We have the blues tent. We don't have a Cajun stage, but we do have the Fado Do stage, and we have a gospel tent. And there were night concerts. The night concerts were a big part of Jazz Fest from the beginning, specifically in the Municipal Auditorium, which kind of makes sense because that was right next door to Congo Square. And the president, it was a riverboat that had been a converted ferry boat, long gone from New Orleans, but they had nighttime concerts, and they actually were still doing nighttime concerts on the president when I got here in 1977. And there were some awesome concerts on the president. I remember one that was James Brown, Junior Walker and the All-Stars, and the opener was Deacon John and the Ivories. And of course, Deke smoked everybody else on the bill that night. And Mardi Gras Indians were present from 1970. It was a big deal. The stuff I've highlighted in red, I just want you to pay particular attention to, because it's going to be tied to some of the roots that we're going to lay in the 1960s. So this is the daytime festival in Congo Square, the range of performers, the gospel, and the night concerts. Okay, now this is the part where we cry. There were approximately 300 attendees in Beauregard Square. The kind of the joke about that festival is there were more performers than there were people in attendance. The single day admission was $3. So I'll pause for all the groaning now. And they lost about $14,000 on $31,000 in ticket sales. The city had been trying to put together a jazz fest since the early 60s. And specifically, they had been going after George Wein to be the producer for the festival. And they were very, very interested in him because he had a great track record, successful in things that were very much related. He was the original producer for the Newport Jazz Festival. This is Newport, Rhode Island, from 1954, which is considered to be really the first big outdoor jazz festival. He got recruited to be the producer for that. And that is some of the recognition for that festival nationally comes from a film that was made from the 1958 Newport Jazz Festival called Jazz on a Summer's Day. It was released in 1959. And then he also initiated the Newport Folk Festival in 1959, one of the first major music festivals aside from the Newport Jazz Festival. And it's particularly known in its history for the location where Bob Dylan went electric. He appeared in 63 and 64. 1965, he actually plugged in and did an electric set, which was very controversial. Some of the folk traditionalists were kind of appalled at what he had done. And then a lot of other festivals under his belt over the years, the JVC, Cool Jazz Festival, a bunch of other stuff. This is the artwork for the a DVD version of the Jazz on a Summer's Day, and you can see Louis Armstrong and Mahalia Jackson were both performers at that festival. And the iconic image that usually survives is, this is Anita O'Day, who was a jazz singer, and she had put on this hat before she went on stage, and that became kind of the buzz for the festival. And this is a picture of Bob Dylan going electric there. He hooked up with the Butterfield Blues Band. The personnel are behind him: Mike Bloomfield, Sam Lay, Jerome Arnold, and Mark Naftalin. This was an early Butterfield Blues Band. So that's the other thing that the Folk Festival was known for. And some of you who are not really intimately familiar with George Wein, but the name may be familiar, it's because of this building on North Rampart Street. It's the George and Joyce Wein Jazz and Heritage Center. And Joyce was George's wife. So they made 3 failed attempts to hook up with George Wein. The first one was in 1962, early in the decade. There was a New Orleans meeting that was set up at the instigation of Olaf Lambert, who was the manager of the Royal Orleans Hotel, which of course is still there, and a bunch of other business leaders and music business representatives. And he came without his wife, Joyce. And this is the first indication that this is going to be a rocky process, because his wife, Joyce, was Black. And they would not have been able to stay in the same hotel or even eat at the same restaurants in New Orleans in 1962. So you know right away this has got a tough beginning. So in the meeting with the discussion, they mutually decided against attempting a jazz festival at that time. And there were a bunch of reasons, but 3 of them really came to the forefront. The Black performers at the jazz festival would not be able to stay in the better hotels. George Wein, in his autobiography, even cited a lot of this conversation where he referenced Duke Ellington and said, if we tried to go after somebody like Duke Ellington, his career was in resurgence at that time, and he was used to being treated like royalty wherever he went. And so to be relegated to a second-class hotel would have been a non-starter. And in fact, one of the participants at that meeting was Seymour Weiss, who is the owner of the Roosevelt Hotel. He had been a compatriot of Huey Long, and according to George Wein, in the conversation, he basically said no niggers would be allowed to stay in his hotel. And I don't know if he was acknowledging it or being adamant about it, but basically he was very upfront about it. Another reason is that a lot of the performers had performance contracts forbidding segregated audiences. So they had in their contracts that they had to allow both Black and white audience members. So there was a conversation back and forth about this. If you remember, Charles talked multiple times about John Kennedy's visit, President Kennedy's visit, and they reflected on that, and they said, well, we had some outdoor events, and those were integrated audience. So maybe that's how we finesse this. We actually do this as an outdoor festival and can allow integrated audiences. And the third thing that they were dealing with was integrated bands. A lot of the bands that they would be trying to hire would have both Black and white performers in them. Again, Wein cited Duke Ellington. At that time, he had a white drummer, and even Louis Armstrong. Post-war, following World War II, he was mostly running a band that was known as the All-Stars, and it always had evolving membership. So at any point in time, it wasn't always the same members, but it was always a mixture of Black and white musicians. And so Louis Armstrong could not have brought his band back to play. So they kind of kicked around all of this stuff and decided, well, okay, this isn't going to work. So you roll a couple of years forward to 1964, and the Civil Rights Act that also was previously mentioned is on the table with Congress. And so Olaf Lambert is getting excited, and he calls another meeting. Gets George Wein involved again, and he's basically saying this is going to be a done deal. The Civil Rights Act is going to pass. We're going to be able to move forward as a city that's ready to shine on the national stage. Let's get going with this jazz festival. So they actually start doing it. They plan it for the spring of 1965 in the Municipal Auditorium. George Wein starts working on bookings. There's a big announcement, a rollout plan for January. But then there's a speed bump, again, that Charles referenced. There was an AFL All-Star game that was scheduled for Christmas Day. And the athletes started coming into the city about 10 days before the game. And these are stars. I mean, these are nationally known celebrities. And the Black athletes, they can't get taxis to pick them up. They can't get reservations at restaurants. They can't get tables at restaurants, let alone get served in the restaurants. So there was enough of an outcry that they actually canceled the game at New Orleans and had it moved to Phoenix. So once again, Wein and the business leaders talked and they canceled the 1965 festival. And it sounded like it came really more from the business leaders than it did from Wein. Again, this is from George Wein's autobiography. They'd had this experience that you already heard about from the earlier part of the decade, where the city got a lot of bad press from their problems with integration. It happens again with the All-Star game. So they essentially did not want to deal with it. And Wein was actually less worried about it. And his point was, a lot of these musicians had been touring for a while, many of them to the Jim Crow South, and they had already had to deal with a lot of this stuff as part of their career, and they weren't happy about it, but he thought they probably could have dealt with it. And in any case, it got canceled. So then, oh, sorry, I did want to point this out. Early on in some of the work, it was actually on the previous talk, the one that was specifically on Jazz Fest before Jazz Fest. Part of what Al had, he actually got the records and material from the Black Musicians Union that had been on Claiborne Avenue. So the current Musicians Union is 174-496, and it's an amalgamation, a forced amalgamation of a previously white and previously Black unions. That's why it's got the double number. And the old Black Musicians Hall used to be on Claiborne Avenue, and it's gone now. But before it was completely lost, Al was able to take possession of a lot of the materials inside, from inside the union, a lot of historical records. And he actually has contracts that were written for this 1965 Jazz Fest. One that generically referenced a brass band, one for Harold Dejan, one for Papa French. And a lot of the source material I had used for putting together the original talk and this talk came from the Second Line magazine of the Jazz Club. This was a jazz club to promote jazz that used to exist in New Orleans. There was a mention of it. I think Charles made a mention of it when he was talking about the rapprochement with Louis Armstrong in the city of New Orleans. And I could find little to no mention of the 1965 Jazz Festival in the Second Line newsletters. And yet I had these contracts in my hand. So I assumed at that time, it took place, but maybe they weren't very heavily involved in it. And now I think, I don't know for sure, but my suspicion is that these were contracts that Wein actually wrote when they thought they were going ahead with it. And then it eventually got canceled, so the performances never came off. And the reason I think that is because, among other things, they're specifically identified as the International Jazz Festival, which is what they were going to call it. Okay, so 65 fails. You roll later into the decade. And there's another attempt to bring in George Wein to produce the Jazz Festival. He has a phone conference with Durrell Black, and they want to make this a big deal because they want to make it part of the 250th anniversary of the founding of New Orleans. So it seems like a very auspicious year to do it. And it goes bust again. And specifically, Ween was rejected by Vic Skiro because he was uncomfortable with George Ween's interracial marriage. And part of what I love about this is, again, to reference Charles' presentation. You saw that photo from the 1970 Jazz Fest, where there are three people side by side on a stage in Congo Square. It's George Ween to the left in the photo, Mahalia Jackson in the middle, and Vic Skiro all the way on the right. And so I love the fact that you got this photo of Vic Skiro, who rejected George Ween as a producer because of an interracial marriage. He's on the stage with him, and in the middle is Mahalia Jackson, probably one of the biggest promoters for New Orleans music. So instead, they hired a guy by the name of Willis Conover. I'm a little unclear as to what role he was hired in. Ween says he was hired as a producer instead of Ween. There's other references to him, maybe just as an MC or maybe a talent guy. But his history was as a board member of the Newport Jazz Festival. So he'd had a long-standing relationship with George Ween. And this kind of bothered George Ween quite a bit because he'd had a close relationship with Conover. And he was very well aware of the failed attempts that Ween had been making to produce this festival. And so for him to step in and be involved in it, Ween kind of thought that was undercutting him. So 1968, doesn't fall apart. The relationship with Ween doesn't work out, but it doesn't fall apart. It goes ahead as a festival. And the International Jazz Festival, as it was called, the nickname for it was Jazz Fest, Jazz Fest 68. So there's a lot of grousing now about the Contemporary Jazz and Heritage Festival where people say, well, I don't know why we call it Jazz Fest, because the jazz music is only a small fraction of what performs, anywhere from 15 to 20% if you're just counting performers. Well, this is why it's called Jazz Fest, because the name has roots all the way back to 1968 in a festival that was really a jazz fest. As I said before, it was part of the 250th anniversary celebration of the founding of New Orleans. Darrell Black was the general chairman. Went from May 12th to the 18th. It was a mixture of national, international, local performers. So the foundation for what happens in 1970 is set right here, although it was mostly jazz of different styles. 5 nights of concerts, and there was a gospel segment during the final Sunday night concert. They used multiple venues, the Municipal Auditorium, Thursday through Sunday, the SS President, and there was a jazz mass at St. Louis Cathedral. And there were about 30,000 attendees in the night concerts. These are the headliners. I think some of these faces were on a poster maybe that Charles had on one of his illustrations. On the left, you've got Louis Armstrong, Pete Fountain, Ramsey Lewis, Duke Ellington, Dave Brubeck, Woody Herman, known for his big band. And on the right, you have some local names, Sharkey Bonanno, George Lewis, and Armand Hug. And so some of the interesting things about this, it's a mixture of both modern and old school jazz. And it's also a mixture of locals and national performers. There was some controversy, though, around the performers. And this is from the Second Line magazine of the Jazz Club. This is an editorial. The committee appointed, I want to read this to you. I'm sorry, I apologize for reading stuff off a screen, but some of this is so entertaining to me. I just feel like I want to read it to you. The committee appointed to select the bands and the performers for the May 12th, May 19th Jazz Fest 68 find themselves in an unenviable position. And in this writer's opinion, they are being taken entirely unfairly. They are called traitors to the cause of New Orleans jazz and jazzmen, because they have included such names as Duke Ellington, the Dave Brubeck Trio plus Jerry Mulligan, Ronnie Cole Trio, Woody Herman Orchestra, Ramsey Lewis, Al Boletto Quartet, Gary Burton Quartet, and a few other of the moderns. So back in 1968, there's the controversy that we deal with today still about, gee, what type of music is good for this festival? And one of the interesting things I find about this is the dynamic of the conflict. It's not about local versus nationals, because some of the names on this list are local people, Al Boletto and Ronnie Cole, but it's modern versus traditional. They're complaining because they're incorporating what we would call modern jazz as part of this jazz festival instead of just being traditional. And this is the rest of the editorial. The presentation of the same New Orleans musicians who can be and are heard day after day, night after night in New Orleans would do nothing to attract special large gatherings. The addition of some of the great names of modern jazz would attract people who would not otherwise stir out of their tracks to hear the same old tired, badly tuned false note being blown all over again in a larger hall. Even if they wore tuxedos, there'd be nothing special to attract customers. Commercial, nuts. It just makes good sense to this writer. I love this, the enthusiasm, and it almost sounds like it's a middle school or a high school level we're talking about here. One of the things about the festival was that Al Hirt did not appear. And this was not because of the festival. This was Al Hirt's manager. His manager specifically wrote a letter. I think I've taken this from a letter that he wrote, saying that Al is no longer a jazz musician. And it would be similarly illogical for him to play in an opera festival. By the same token, Al is passing up the Newport Jazz Festival and the Monterey Jazz Festival because he now plays contemporary music and music with that Nashville sound. We just wouldn't fit on any specific jazz or Dixieland type program. So Al Hirt is trying to rebrand himself as a non-jazz player. And if you've heard the stuff he recorded from that period, it would be some of the albums like Man with a Horn. It does sound, it's very distinctly Nashville sound. It's got strings on it. There's that classic vocal quartet backing up a lot of what he does, and it is just awful. Fortunately, I think he left that later in his career and really reverted to more what we know him for. And the recap, there was also a jazz mass. And that's really mostly what I care about for this quote that Al Boletto is citing the memorial mass for deceased jazz musicians. Archbishop Hannon did the sermon, and it's much longer than this, but I wanted to excerpt this portion of it just to highlight a few things. Though I am the first to admit that I am not a student of music, it has always seemed to me that jazz was a valuable and valid form of musical expression. Its rhythm was derived from many lands, my italics here, though obviously its source was Africa. It was a vehicle for the expression of the hopes, the sorrows, the trials, the joy, the frustration of many peoples, though the language was that of Negro origin. For jazz was an open-end dialogue for all men, especially the suffering. What I like about this is Archbishop Hannon is taking the time to describe this as music that was an African or African-American origin. And this has a whole history of controversy in terms of sources of jazz. There's still the thing with Nick LaRocca talking about his claim that the jazz originally came from all white musicians and black musicians that had nothing to do with it. So I think in 1968, when we're still in the middle of all this civil rights controversy, Archbishop Hannon made a choice. He did not have to do this. He made a choice to wade into this fray with this identification of the origins of jazz. Stanley Dance, who was a national critic, thought very favorably of the Jazz Festival. The most logical place in the world to hold a jazz festival is in the city where the music was born. It was a huge success. And again, I love this quote. They're saying it would eventually rank along with Mardi Gras, Sugar Bowl, Spring Fiesta, and the New Orleans Open. And I love it because, of course, at the time, Spring Fiesta was the big deal. And now I think relative to Spring Fiesta and New Orleans Open, I don't know if Jazz Fest is bigger than Sugar Bowl or Mardi Gras, but it's a big deal as far as tourism and identification of the city. All right, so 1969 happens again. Darrell Black is still the general chairman. A lot of this looks similar to what we had already talked about. There was a Sunday afternoon soul session, and notably in terms of a change, there was an international food festival. Monday night at the Plimsoll Club atop the International Trade Mart. So you don't yet have this kind of heritage fair kind of thing, but at least you're starting to expand beyond the music. And again, we'll pause for the groaning. The concert admission was $2 to $5. Some of the performers, they had, you can see the Soul Session, Sarah Vaughan Gospel Ensemble. They had Pete Fountain and Clark Terry on The President. Lots of stuff at the Municipal Auditorium, just packed concerts, mostly a mixture of modern and traditional. So you see Dizzy Gillespie here in the Jim Robinson Ensemble. That'd be a national modernist compared to a local traditionalist. Municipal Auditorium, similar thing, Sarah Vaughan and a couple of classic piano players. Municipal Auditorium Friday night, this is one I wish I had been there for. Count Basie with alumni Buck Clayton, Dickie Wells, Buddy Tate, and Earl Warren. And the interesting thing about this is Count Basie had decades running a big band, but there were really two distinctly different big bands. There was one pre-war that was very blues-based. The arrangements were a lot of head arrangements, meaning they were made up in the bandstand. And then post-war, he had this juggernaut, this really impressive, powerful band, Quincy Jones arrangements. So even though he had a big band in two different periods, they were stylistically totally different. And these were alumni from pre-war. So in 1969, you could have seen the pre-war alumni. And then on Saturday night, you had a concert that was just overpacked. In fact, that was one of the criticisms of the concert. And they had a house band, nationally known performers, Clark Terry, Zoot Sims, Jackie Byard, Milt Hinton, and Alan Dawson. There actually is a video clip, I've been able to find it on YouTube, of this band playing a morning show broadcast from the courtyard of Two Sisters. As far as the aftermath, this was an editorial that happened was in the Second Line magazine for the Jazz Club, talking about the high quality of the concert. And the part that I really like is the stuff I put in italics. Again, these are my italics. To the credit of the festival staff, Jazz Fest has not turned to the blatant commercialism of Newport. In the words of talent director Willis Conover, Jazz Fest is the world's only all jazz festival. Oops, sorry, let's go back. And I love it specifically that he is citing the commercialism of Newport, which of course means George Wein. And the next year, Darrell Black goes out and hires George Wein to run the Jazz Fest, which, as we know, has become a great success. There were some in the 1950s. They had big aspirations. The main thing about this is it was just a huge event they were looking to do. And I was interested in this just because of one of the racial aspects, that there is a notation from Charles Suhor in Jazz Race and Raids that white and black bands were on stage together at the finale of the 1951 Jazz Festival. So even though you didn't have integrated bands, you had white and black performers on stage. All right, now we come to the extra credit portion. So get ready to put your answer in the chat room. What music festival took place in late summer of 1969 and featured Santana, Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, Country Joe and the Fish, The Grateful Dead, Canned Heat, and Sweetwater? Okay, so I'll give you time to think about it. And I have some more information for you, some more clues. The festival also featured the Byrds, Chicago Transit Authority, Iron Butterfly, the Youngbloods, It's a Beautiful Day, Tyrannosaurus Rex, and Spiral Staircase. Everybody remember Spiral Staircase? I Love You More Today Than Yesterday. That was the big hit. And the clue that I think that's really going to do it, as well as Dr. John Voodoo Show and Deacon John and the Electric Soul Train. So the bait and switch is, I know you were thinking, yeah, it could have been Woodstock, was the New Orleans Pop Festival. Labor Day weekend in 1969 at the Louisiana International Speedway, which was in Prairieville, Louisiana. It was not in New Orleans, in Prairieville. Featured 26 bands and had a peak attendance of 25 to 30,000 people. So 3 weeks earlier, you could have gone up to upstate New York and hung out with 500,000 of your closest personal friends, or you could have gone just up the river and had a much more intimate experience with 26 bands and 25,000 to 30,000 people. And the bonus round. There was a band named White Clover that also appeared at the festival. In 1970, its core members merged with other musicians and changed their name to, I'll give you a minute, Kansas. So essentially the roots of Kansas appeared at this pop festival before they became Kansas. So that's the talk. I just wanted to talk about some sources and some other reading if people wanted to do it. There's a Second Line newsletter that the Jazz Club produced. I don't know if it's actually a newsletter or a magazine. It's available from the Hogan Jazz Archives. It goes back to the late 1940s and goes all the way up until the club went out of business. And a lot of the other information I've talked about came from George Weins' autobiography, myself among others, A Life in Jazz. It's from 2004. And the whole book is interesting, but there is a chapter in there that George Wein talks about New Orleans and his relationship with New Orleans. And then Keith Sparrow, so what's this, a year and a half ago, published a nice article, I would call it a complimentary article, called The New Orleans Jazz Fest is Celebrating 50 Years, but its history is older and messier. And this is the title that was online. So I'm not really, I know it was published in the paper, but I don't remember the title from then. And he covers a lot of the same ground, but he has a little bit different spin on it. He resourced a lot more of the newspaper records. So that's a nice complement to the talk if you want to pursue some of this further. And that's all I have.
Great, Dave. Thank you so much. Is there any film footage of the Prairie View Festival?
Not that I've found. So there clearly there's a lots of archival photographs, and it may be out there, and I just haven't found it yet. I haven't researched that extensively. I did some casual looking. As you know, of course, there is the footage from the 1970 festival that we use all the time, but there's nothing from the 1969 Prairieville Festival that I've been able to find.
There is a link that Emily posted from HNOC. She works at HNOC, and she has posted a link to the Pop Festival poster at the Historic New Orleans Collection. So that is a neat little click that. If you want to click that in the chat area, you can dive into it there. She says it's not digitized yet, but maybe we can see if we can get it digitized in the future. So thank you, Dave. I appreciate it. And if anybody else have any questions,
thank you, Jason.
Yeah, thank you. And we're going to we're not taking too many breaks, but we're going to have a break after Bruce speaks. So let me just stop my recording and do my recording again.